This is SOSF. You ever see one of these giant, untouchable corporations just completely screw the pooch? I mean, just faceplant so hard in public that you can't look away. It's wild. So, for anybody who plays video games, you know the Battlefield franchise, right? It's been around forever. It's the one with the jets and the tanks and these giant maps where 64 people are just running around creating absolute chaos. It's beautiful, man. But a few years back, in 2021, they dropped a game called Battlefield 2042, and it was a catastrophe. A complete, unmitigated disaster. It was like they took everything people loved about the series, threw it in a blender with a bunch of weird ideas that nobody asked for, and served up this chunky, bizarre smoothie that everyone spit out. The whole thing almost tanked the entire franchise. People were done. They were burning their jerseys in the street, you know? So the company behind it, this giant called Electronic Arts, or EA, they were in panic mode. They had this multi-billion-dollar thing that was now, like, radioactive. So what do? It's a wild story, man. They just launched the new one, Battlefield 6, and it's a monster. It sold over 7 million copies in 3 days. 3 days? It's the biggest launch they've ever had. So, on the surface, it looks like this triumphant, Rocky Balboa comeback story. But I was reading this deep dive report on it, and the story behind the scenes is absolutely insane. It's this crazy mix of genius, desperation, and just a complete corporate train wreck. It cost them a fortune, something like over $400 million to make. 400 million. That's more than most Marvel movies, man. And the human cost, the burnout on the developers. It's a wild ride. It's one of those things where you see the shiny, successful product on the shelf, but the story of how it got there is just a total knife fight in a back alley. So, let's get into it. The whole strategy for this new game, Battlefield 6, was basically a giant apology tour. It's fascinating from a business perspective. After the last game, the developers and the players were completely disconnected. The players were screaming, "We hate this," and the company was just plugging its ears going, "La la la. You'll love our new wacky characters." See, in 2042, they got rid of the classic class system. For people who don't play, that system is the whole foundation of the game. It's rock, paper, scissors. You've got the assault guy, who's the frontline fighter. You've got the engineer, whose job is to take out tanks but also to fix your own vehicles. You've got the support guy, the heavy gunner who's dropping ammo for everyone. And you have the recon guy, the sniper, spotting enemies from a distance. Everybody has a job. It forces you to work as a team. But in the last game, they replaced that with these things called specialists. They were basically like hero characters from other games, like Overwatch or Apex Legends. Each one had a name and a special gadget, and it just broke the whole formula. Suddenly, you had a team full of guys who could all do the same thing. Nobody was dropping ammo, nobody was healing, and the whole tactical teamwork part just evaporated. It was just a chaotic mess. The hardcore fans, the people who have been playing these games for 20 years, they absolutely despised it. So, for Battlefield 6, the first thing EA did was walk out on stage, metaphorically speaking, and just say, "We're sorry. We screwed up." They completely axed the specialists. Gone. And they brought back the classic 4-class system. That was signal number one to the community that they were actually listening. They also got rid of the 128-player matches. That was another big, flashy feature from the last game that sounded cool on paper, but in reality, it was just too chaotic. The maps were too big, you'd be running for 5 minutes without seeing anyone, and the performance was terrible. They dialed it back to the classic 64-player count that everyone knew and loved. The message was crystal clear. The weird, wacky experiment is over. We're going back to what works. We're giving you the game you've been asking us to make for the last decade. And they didn't just stop there. They were so terrified of getting it wrong again that they did something pretty unprecedented for a company this big. They started this program called Battlefield Labs. Basically, months before the game was even officially announced, they started inviting hardcore players, streamers, and community members to playtest the game. Not just to find bugs, but to give feedback on the core design. Things like, how do the guns feel? Is the destruction cool enough? Does this class system work the way it should? It was a public act of reconciliation. They were holding their hands up and saying, "You guys are the experts. Tell us how to make the game you want to play." It was a brilliant move, really. It was a calculated, risk-aversion strategy. After losing so much money and goodwill, they weren't interested in taking any more creative risks. They wanted a guaranteed home run. And the safest way to do that was to just remake the glory days, specifically the fan-favorite games Battlefield 3 and 4, but with modern graphics and technology. Battlefield Labs was their insurance policy, a way to constantly check in with the customer to make sure they were still on the right track. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. While all this good stuff was happening on the surface, the community outreach, the return to the classic formula, behind the curtain, the development was an absolute circus. A chaotic, ridiculously expensive, soul-crushing circus. To make this biggest Battlefield ever, EA decided to throw all their resources at it. They formed this new supergroup called Battlefield Studios. It wasn't one studio making the game, it was a coalition of 4 different, world-class studios all roped together. First, you have DICE in Sweden, the original creators. They're the heart and soul, the guys who handle the core multiplayer gameplay. Then you have Motive Studio in Canada, who are known for making amazing single-player stories, like the Dead Space remake. Their job was the single-player campaign. Then you have Criterion Games in the UK, the wizards who make the Need for Speed racing games. They're masters at making vehicles feel amazing to drive, so they were put in charge of all the tanks, helicopters, and jeeps. And finally, you have Ripple Effect Studios in Los Angeles, which is full of Battlefield veterans, and they were tasked with the live service stuff and a secret new mode. On paper, it sounds like the Avengers of video game development, right? You've assembled this dream team of specialists to build the ultimate game. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, pretty much everything. Coordinating a massive global workforce spread across different time zones and studio cultures is a logistical nightmare. And the pressure from the corporate overlords at EA was immense. The biggest disaster, the real smoking crater in the middle of this whole project, was the single-player campaign. Initially, they gave that job to a brand new studio they set up in Seattle called Ridgeline Games. And they hired this legend to run it, a guy named Marcus Lehto, who was one of the co-creators of the original Halo. I mean, that's a power move. You get one of the fathers of the modern shooter to build your story mode. But it was a doomed enterprise from the start. According to a really in-depth report from Ars Technica, Ridgeline was a new studio being built from scratch. They had to hire everyone, set up their offices, figure out how they work together, all while being held to the same insane, aggressive deadlines as the veteran studios that had been working together for decades. It was an impossible task. The campaign fell further and further behind schedule. It was a total mess. Then, in early 2024, Marcus Lehto just abruptly leaves the company. A little while later he posts on social media, and this is a direct quote, "Man," he said he had nothing positive to say about EA, my recent departure, and how so many, including my team, are suffering. Whoa, that's a guy who is not happy. That's a scorched earth comment right there. Shortly after that, EA just shut the whole studio down. They just closed the doors on Ridgeline Games. So after 2 years of development, the campaign was dead. The responsibility for it got thrown onto the other studios, Motive, DICE, Criterion, who were already swamped with their own work. And when they got the files, when they looked at what Ridgeline had made over 2 years, there was nothing usable. Nothing. They had to start the entire single-player campaign from scratch. Let that sink in. 2 years of work, millions of dollars, and the efforts of an entire studio just got deleted. They were a full year behind schedule before they even laid the first brick of the new campaign. This is where the money pit opens up. Because of all these delays, the constant restarts, and the sheer size of the combined workforce, the budget just exploded. It spiraled past $400 million. To put that in perspective, that's more than it cost to make Avatar: The Way of Water. It's an insane amount of money to gamble on a single product. And on top of that, the EA executives had these, what the developers called, unrealistic expectations. They set a target of getting 100 million players for the game. The most any Battlefield game had ever had in its entire lifetime was around $30 million. They weren't just trying to make a successful game. They were trying to create a global phenomenon on the scale of Fortnite or Call of Duty. So you've got this dysfunctional, fragmented development team, a collapsed campaign, a budget that's out of control, and these sky-high expectations from the suits upstairs. The reports from inside the studios painted a pretty grim picture. Developers were under extraordinary stress and working long hours. There were cultural clashes between the different studios. A belief started to spread among the staff that there was no way they could finish the game on time without cutting huge chunks of it. The whole all-in super studio model, which was supposed to be the solution to their problems, had just created a bigger, more complicated set of new problems. It wasted years of work, burned out its employees, and bloated the budget to a point that is just not sustainable. So, what kind of game do you get at the end of that chaotic pipeline? Well, let's talk about the campaign first, because it's the most obvious victim of this whole mess. The single-player story they ended up shipping is fine, I guess. It's a generic, by-the-numbers military shooter story. You're part of an elite U.S. Marine squad fighting a powerful private military company that's trying to take over the world. It's a plot you've seen 100 times. And it's not that it's offensively bad, it's just bland. It's shallow. It feels like a cheap knockoff of a modern warfare campaign. And you can feel the rushed development in its DNA. Reviewers pointed out that it feels completely disconnected from what makes Battlefield special. For example, there's a mission where you have to escort a tank through a city. In a normal Battlefield game, you'd be driving that tank, blowing holes in buildings, causing mayhem. In this campaign, you just walk alongside it. You never even get to use its turret. There's another part with a helicopter that's just a non-interactive cutscene. All the things that define Battlefield, the huge open battles, the freedom to use any vehicle, the meaningful destruction where you can level entire buildings, it's all missing or heavily scripted. You're just running down a narrow corridor from one gunfight to the next, and it makes perfect sense when you know the backstory. They had to build this thing from the ground up in an incredibly short amount of time. The quickest, easiest, and least risky way to do that is to just copy the linear, heavily scripted style of your competitors and rely on tired old shooter tropes. There was no time to develop a deep story or complex characters. The campaign basically exists to check a box on the back of the game case that says includes single-player campaign. It's the ghost of its own troubled development. But okay, let's be fair. The campaign was always a side dish. The main course of any Battlefield game is the multiplayer. And this is where the focus, the money, and the talent really went. This is what they got right. As we said, the absolute centerpiece was bringing back the 4 classes: Assault, Engineer, Support, Recon. They rebuilt it from the ground up to encourage teamwork. Each class gets special bonuses for using their specific weapon types. Like, the Assault guy can aim his assault rifle faster after sprinting, and the Recon guy can hold his breath longer to steady his sniper shots. They each have unique gadgets that define their role, like the Engineer's repair tool or the Support's ammo bags, and then they added a new layer called Training Paths, which are like subclasses. So if you're playing as Assault, you can choose the Breacher path to get better at using explosives and fighting up close, or you could be a frontliner and get more health and be better at supporting your squad. It's a great system. It brings back that tactical depth that was missing. It makes you feel like you have a specific job to do on the battlefield. But then they did something weird. Something that shows they were still trying to please everyone at once. They couldn't decide how to handle the weapons. In the old-school Battlefield games, your weapon choices were restricted by your class. If you were a medic, you used submachine guns. If you were a support gunner, you used a big light machine gun. This forced you into a specific role. But in a lot of modern shooters like Call of Duty, you can use pretty much any gun you want. So what did Battlefield 6 do? It did both. The default setting of the game is what they call open weapons. Any class can use any primary weapon. So you can be a support guy running around with a sniper rifle, or an engineer with a heavy machine gun. It gives you total freedom, which some people love. But the hardcore veterans hated it, because they felt it diluted the unique identity of the classes. If an engineer can use the best assault rifle in the game, why would anyone ever play as the assault class? So, to appease those purists, they also have separate playlists called closed weapons, where the old rules apply. In those modes, you can only use the weapon types designated for your class. It's this strange compromise. It feels like they were trying to be 2 different games at the same time. It's a microcosm of the whole project, right? Trying to win back the old fans while also trying to be more like Call of Duty to attract a broader audience. By trying to serve 2 masters, they ended up with this fractured design that doesn't feel totally confident in its own identity. Now, the tech behind all this is actually super interesting. The game runs on their own in-house engine called Frostbite. People were asking why they didn't just use something like the Unreal Engine 5, which is what a lot of other big games are using now. And the developers said it's because Frostbite is specifically built to do 2 things really well: massive scale destruction and the complex networking required for huge 64-player battles. To rebuild that kind of technology in a different engine would have taken them years. And the destruction is back in a big way. The key decision they made, what the technical director called the only magic trick, was to completely abandon the old PlayStation 4 and Xbox One consoles. This game is only for the PlayStation 5, the new Xbox Series consoles, and PC. By doing that, they dramatically raised the minimum power they had to work with. They weren't held back by 10-year-old hardware anymore. That gave them the freedom to implement way more complex, physics-based destruction. Buildings crumble more realistically, explosions have a bigger impact, the whole environment feels more dynamic, and the performance is fantastic. On the new consoles, it runs super smooth. And on PC, it's really well optimized. They also got serious about cheating, which is a huge problem in PC shooters. They rolled out a new, proprietary anti-cheat system called Javelin. This thing operates at the kernel level of your computer's operating system. That's the deepest level, man. It's like having a security guard who lives inside the foundation of your house. It allows it to detect really sophisticated cheats that other systems might miss. And to make it work, you have to have modern security features like Secure Boot enabled on your PC. This basically prevents cheaters from loading their malicious software before the game and the anti-cheat even start up. And it seems to work. During the open beta test, EA reported that Javelin blocked over 330,000 cheat attempts. It's not perfect. The most advanced private cheats will probably always find a way, but it's a massive step in the right direction. Okay, so beyond just rebuilding the old formula, they did introduce a couple of really cool, genuinely innovative new ideas to the multiplayer. The first one is a new flagship game mode called Escalation, and this thing is brilliant. It's a 64-player mode that's an evolution of their classic Conquest mode. A match starts with a huge map and 7 different control points. To score, your team has to control a majority of those points. Once a team scores, one of the control points gets permanently removed from the map, and the playable area shrinks. The first team to score 3 points wins. The design philosophy here is genius. The match starts as a classic, sprawling battlefield experience. You've got tanks fighting over a flag on one side of the map, and helicopters supporting infantry on the other. But as the match goes on and points get removed, the front lines get tighter and tighter. It forces all 64 players into an increasingly smaller space. The last few minutes of the match are just this incredibly intense, concentrated, chaotic firefight for the last 1 or 2 objectives. It creates this natural crescendo of action and allows for these amazing last-minute comebacks. It's a really smart design that could become a new staple for the series. But the other new feature, man, this is the wildest and maybe the most important thing they did. They brought back a feature from the last game called Battlefield Portal, but they completely reimagined it. Portal is a creation suite that lets players build their own custom game modes and experiences. But in the old game, it was a pretty basic visual editor. This time, they went all out. The entire Portal creation suite, the map editor, the logic scripting, all of it, was built using a custom version of the Godot game engine. Now, for people who don't know, Godot is a powerful, professional-grade, and completely open-source game engine. This is a landmark move for a huge AAA publisher. They essentially gave their community a professional software development kit. They gave them the tools to create original maps, script entirely new game modes with complex rules, and share them with everyone. Think about how crazy that is. A company like EA, which is notoriously protective of its technology, just handed the keys to a powerful creation tool to its players. They did this because building a user-friendly 3D editor from scratch is a monumental task, and giving away a modified version of their own proprietary Frostbite engine is a massive security risk. So they brilliantly leveraged a mature, open-source engine to do the job. It's a win-win. They get an amazing user-generated content platform, and the open-source community gets this massive validation. To show off how powerful it was, before the game even launched, the developers showcased a perfect recreation of the iconic Dust 2 map from Counter-Strike that they built inside the Portal. The community went nuts. Within 2 days of the game's release, players had already built a faithful remake of the shipment map from Call of Duty and all sorts of other crazy stuff. This is a game changer. For a live service game that needs a constant stream of new content to keep people playing, what better way than to empower your community to make it for you? It's a quiet but potentially revolutionary move that could change how big publishers think about user content forever. So, the game launches. And commercially, it's a smash hit. Biggest launch in franchise history, like we said. Mainstream critics are generally loving it. They're praising the polished gunplay, the incredible sound design, and the return to the chaotic fun of the classic formula. Compared to the dumpster fire launch of the last game, this one was stable, well executed, and a huge relief. The comeback story was complete. But a weird thing started to happen. While the broader market was celebrating, a very vocal part of the hardcore, veteran community was disappointed. Their complaints weren't about the game being broken like 2042 was. Their complaint was that it felt safe, hollow. They said that when you compare it not to the last game, but to the peak of the series like Battlefield 4, it feels like a step back. They pointed to a smaller number of weapons and vehicles at launch, the complete absence of naval combat, no attack boats, no jet skis, and map designs that felt a bit small and uninspired. They missed the big dynamic Levolution events from BF4, where you could trigger a giant skyscraper to collapse and completely change the layout of the map. For these players, Battlefield 6 wasn't a triumphant return to form. It was a well-made but shallow imitation of past glories. And that created these two competing narratives. For most people, it was the great comeback. For the diehards, it was a safe, unambitious entry that lacked the depth they loved. And that's a dangerous place to be for a live service game. You might get the big initial sales from the casual crowd, but the long-term health of the game depends on the dedication of that hardcore community. So, where does that leave us? This whole saga is just a fascinating case study. In the end, Battlefield 6 is a massive, undeniable success. It pulled a multi-billion-dollar franchise back from the brink of death. It proved that if you just listen to your fans and execute a beloved formula with a high degree of polish, you can make a ridiculous amount of money. The market was screaming for a return to basics, and EA delivered. But that victory came at a staggering cost. The brutal development, the $400 million+ budget, the dysfunctional coalition of studios, the complete collapse of the campaign, the reports of developer burnout. It paints a really grim picture of what it takes to make a blockbuster game these days. The project was driven by these insane corporate ambitions that put an unsustainable financial and human burden on the creators. So, Battlefield 6 is both a success story and a really stark cautionary tale. It shows that going back to basics can be hugely profitable. But it also shows that the all-in model of just throwing more money, more studios, and more pressure at a problem doesn't guarantee a smooth ride or even a better product. The multiplayer worked because it stuck to a proven formula. The campaign failed because it was a casualty of a broken, chaotic process. The ultimate question isn't whether other companies can replicate the success of Battlefield 6, but whether it's possible to do it without also replicating the punishing, unsustainable, and deeply flawed process that brought it to life. Is this just the new reality? That for a game to be this big and this successful, it has to be born from a crucible of chaos and burnout? It makes you wonder about the future of these massive entertainment products. Are we building shiny castles on foundations of sand? And that brings up a wild thought, especially with that Portal Creator tool they released. We talked about how players are already recreating maps from other games. What happens when they get really good with these tools? What happens 5 years from now, when a team of talented amateurs uses this official, powerful engine to build an entirely new game inside of Battlefield 6 that's actually better, more creative, and more innovative than the main game itself? What does a company like EA do then? Do they embrace it, or do they see it as a threat? It's a crazy thought. What happens when the fans are given the tools to? See you next time.